All right, we're in the second part of this lecture, and in this section, we're discussing the Dolgoff framework. So this is a basic framework that you'll be using to examine your chosen policy topic, your project topic, in other words. And so I use that term examine. Examine very carefully. Notice I didn't say analyzing. So policy analysis is a whole other animal that we'll engage in for the entire semester in your second policy class, but for now, we're just providing you a basic framework for just looking at a policy, examining a policy, and then communicating your understanding of that policy to an educated audience. That's the broader objective with providing you with this framework that comes from a different textbook written by Dolgoff. So I refer to it as the Dolgoff framework. And so when you're describing a policy and how it functions, Dolgoff suggests that you look at some basic dimensions here, and he notes 5 different dimensions in the way of the needs, the societal needs that your policy is intended to address, or another way to think about it is the goals of the program itself, or the policy itself. He also mentions that you should comment on the benefit that's offered by your agency or your program, and eligibility. You certainly want to say something about how one becomes eligible for the benefit or service that's offered by your agency. You want to say something about the financing, how your program or policy is in fact funded. And then, of course, the 5th dimension here is about administration, or how your program is in fact administered. There's a whole discussion, a whole separate section about alternative characteristics that you can also comment on and describe to your audience. And I just select out 3 here for our purposes that I think are useful. So you do want to say something about residual versus institutional thinking or philosophy, whether your program reflects this residual thinking or institutional thinking. Second dimension, I'd like you to say something about selective principles versus universal principles, whether your program reflects one or the other. And then finally about public versus private entities, and whether your program is affiliated with the government or not, basically. Okay, and so let me just go through these one by one. So first, in the way of the basic needs and goals, the needs, the societal needs that your program is intended to address, and the goals of the policy or the program itself. So all those issues that you've identified for your policy topic, so all the social issues, child maltreatment, human trafficking, nutrition, or homelessness, these are all the needs, societal needs that your chosen policy or program is intended to address. So you certainly want a section in your paper discussing the societal needs or the social issue or the problems. These are just different ways of saying the same thing that your chosen policy or program is intended to address, right? And then you can frame this discussion a little bit differently by not commenting on the societal issue, but commenting on the policy or the program itself, right? And say something about the goals of the program. So your program may be a bit narrowly tailored to the societal issue that you've identified, right? Whether it's homelessness or whether it's child maltreatment, but your program may be a little more holistic in nature. So I'm thinking about a program like Head Start, where the basic goal there is not just to provide early education, but there might be a socialization component, there might be a recreational component, in which case those are goals of a more holistic nature, and so you want to note that in this section of your discussion. So there's a point that Dolgoff makes about distinction between explicit goals and implicit goals. I don't want you to take this argument too far because this can get a little bit far-fetched in my opinion. But Dolgoff is stating that sometimes you have explicit goals that are contained in the legislation itself. So the example that he gives is in the way of the food stamp program or supplemental nutrition assistance. So the explicit goal there, of course, in the way of the food stamp program is in alleviating hunger and malnutrition and making sure people have an adequate diet, certainly, and that's in the legislation. But Dolgoff says there might be some implicit goals. So reading between the lines, there might be an implicit government objective to control people's behavior. Now, that to me sounds a little bit like on the edge of conspiracy theory-like, and so I think that's my sort of issue with this line of reasoning. So you don't need to take this argument too far, but note that there may be some implicit goals that are being addressed by your chosen policy or program. There's another dimension that you certainly want to comment on, and that's the type and the level of the benefit or the service that's offered by your agency. And so first thing, in the way of the form, the type of the benefit, These are examples here. If you're talking about unemployment insurance, for example, and if you're identifying the form of the benefit, certainly this is a program offering cash assistance, temporary cash assistance. So we're noting the type of the benefit. If you're doing a project on a family social service agency, certainly the type or the form of the benefit might be in the way of individual, group, or family counseling. If your project is on the housing voucher program or Section 8, the form of the benefit is certainly in the way of low-cost, affordable housing in terms of the form of the benefit. The point here is to comment on both the form of the benefit and the level of the benefit that's offered, right? So is it a cash assistance program? Is it an in-kind program? Is it a near-cash program? I shouldn't say but you also want to comment on the level of the benefit. So if it's a cash assistance program, is the assistance a level of cash that's provided by a program adequate to meet people's basic needs is the issue that you want to address? Or even in the case of the Family Social Service Agency and the counseling that's offered, is the counseling offered by the agency, is it adequate to meet people's basic needs? Those are issues that you want to comment on in this section of your paper. You certainly want to comment on eligibility, so I'm giving examples here of different eligibility requirements for different programs. So SNAP, certainly you need to meet basic federal poverty guidelines, and there may be some earnings disregards that are incorporated in discussion also. If you're talking about community mental health services and how one becomes eligible for that type of service, there may be some jurisdictional requirement in which you have to live within that district to be provided services by that agency. Medicare certainly has different eligibility requirements, 3 different pathways into Medicare eligibility on the basis of age, on the basis of disability insurance. If you've been receiving SSDI for at least 2 years, you also qualify for Medicare. End-stage renal disease or kidney failure, you also qualify for Medicare. Social Security has different eligibility requirements. You have to contribute for at least 10 years. You have to accumulate 40 credits. In other words, daycare, your kids must be of a certain age. So the point here is that you want to comment on how one becomes eligible for your selected policy or program. Now, the point that I'm making in the last section here is about the importance of these last 2 sections, commenting on the benefit that's offered and the eligibility for your chosen policy or program. This is crucial. This is arguably the most important section of your paper. You have to have this down. This has to be very accurate, obviously, right? I don't know if, so maybe very accurate is not the right term, but this has to be spot on, right? These last 2 sections. You want to comment on the financing, right? The funding stream. You want to talk not only about the sources of funding, right? What are the sources from which your agency derives their funding? And then you want to track the stream, right? What's the pathway that the revenue will take to the actual use of the revenue? So how does your agency or your policy or program actually spend that revenue? You want to track that entire funding stream or funding mechanism. And so Dolgoff has given you different examples here. General revenue funding, we talked about this stuff before in the context of social insurance and public assistance programs. So general revenue funding, dedicated or earmarked financing. A different term that Dolgoff is using here is in the way of payroll funding or payroll taxes. You may have taxes assessed on both businesses and workers, or payments by the recipients themselves, or some combination of these different types of revenue streams. So let me just offer a few more comments here for each of these different types of funding mechanisms. So in the way of general revenue funding, we were talking in the context of government programs, right? How public assistance programs are characterized by general revenue funding. This term can also apply at the level of the agency or an organization, right? So it's not just referring to the government itself, but maybe private entities may be characterized by general revenue funding, in which case, giving you one example, if you're talking about the Alzheimer's Association, for example, they may be using their revenue for general purposes, right? They may be using that revenue to operate their local chapters, for example. We talked about dedicated earmark funding, how we have very specific taxes being used for very specific purposes in the way of our social insurance program. So once again, this term is not only used at the government level, but also at the private organizational level. So once again, if we're talking about the Alzheimer's Association, they may be using their revenue, the donations that come in, they may be using that revenue for research purposes, right? Dedicated to a specific purpose in which case that's also characterized as dedicated or earmarked funding. So this is similar to dedicated or earmarked financing, and this is in the way of employer-employee taxes. So some of our programs require a payroll tax, which is to say that it's not only the workers that fund the system, but also the employers also fund certain systems. So Social Security is operated by payroll tax. Medicare is funded through a payroll tax. And so maybe that characterizes your chosen policy or project. And then, of course, another type of funding mechanism that's commented on by Dolgoff is in the way of payment by the recipients themselves. Right? So you may have something called a sliding scale fee, in which fees are assessed depending on your ability to pay, on the potential recipient's ability to pay. There may be a higher fee for higher income workers versus a lower fee for lower income workers. And then finally, there may be any combination of these different funding mechanisms. The last of the basic structural components that you want to comment on is also you want to say something about how your program is, in fact, administered. And so there may be a federal government administration, so it's maybe the national government that's operating your chosen policy or program, or you may have a state policy or program. The state government may be operating the program exclusively. And then, of course, Dolgoff makes the point that there may be joint administration by both the federal and the state governments. And so this is a theme that's also picked up in your Dolgoff reading, or not in your Dolgoff reading, but in the Lindhorst article commenting on federalism. Let me just make one quick note about something that's discussed by Dolgoff, and that's the idea of a block grant. So Dolgoff discusses the block grant in this section on administration, but for me, this should have been discussed in the section on financing, on one of the different ways to finance a policy or program. But the larger point here, I think, with Dolgoff that he's making is that you may have joint administration at both the federal and the state levels, and that's the point to take away in this section. And Dolgoff is looking at the history of our policies and programs that are offered for low-income populations. So typically, it was the case that the federal government would support anywhere between 50 to 80% of the costs of administering our welfare programs. That's our welfare program and Medicaid, for example. Nowadays, the government will go anywhere between the federal government will go anywhere between 50 to 100% of costs. But the larger point here, once again, is that you may have joint administration at both the federal and the state levels. All right, so let me just comment on some of the alternative characteristics that I'd like you to discuss in your papers. And one is this distinction between residual thinking and institutionalist thinking. And so the question to ask yourselves in this discussion is to think about your chosen policy or program and to ask yourself if your policy or program, is it intended to come in as a last resort, right? Is it expected that private entities assist those in need? Private entities should be addressing your societal issue that you've identified, and then your chosen policy or program comes in as a last resort. If so, then that reflects residual thinking or residualist thinking. If it happens to be that your chosen policy or program is so ingrained in our society that it's become an institution or a matter of right, then that, of course, reflects institutionalist thinking. And you want to make that distinction in this section. So I note here about public assistance programs, how they're typically structured as residual programs, right? They're intended only as a matter of last resort versus some of our social insurance programs, like Social Security. Arguably, we've come to expect Social Security as a matter of right, which in turn would reflect institutionalist type thinking. You also want to comment on the selectivity or the universality that attaches to the structure of your chosen policy or program. And so if you have a program that's residual in nature, certainly there's an alignment here between selective thinking. If there's some sort of test of income and assets, most likely that's a selective program that's targeted to a certain population that reflects selective principles. But if your program is intended to be more universal in nature, that is, anyone who works and contributes may potentially become eligible, then of course that reflects more universal thinking. And there's a caveat that Dolgoff offers here, and that's the point that some programs may reflect both selective and universal principles. An example that Dolgoff gives is in the way of student loan programs. So arguably, student loan programs are both selective and universal in the sense that they're going to check your income and or assets. A particular student loan program may be checking those aspects of your finances to establish eligibility, but at the same time, anyone could potentially benefit. So any student could potentially benefit. And so it's the argument that, that in the case of student loans, it may reflect both selective and universal principles. And then finally, you want to comment on the public or the private nature of your chosen policy or program. If there's any affiliation to the government, if it's an arm of the government, whether federal, state, local, that's obviously going to be public in nature. And then if it's a private entity that you're addressing in your papers, that's going to be that's obviously a private entity. And so there's a separate distinction here between private for-profit entities and private non-profit entities. You don't necessarily have to look at the way that your policy or program is in fact structured, or the filing that went into forming your agency. That is it a 501c3, in which case it's a non-profit entity? Is there a profit structure in place? You don't need to comment that far. The more important distinction here is in the way of a public-private distinction. Okay? All right, the last part for your paper is to say something about the adequacy of the benefits or the services that are offered by your agency. And we know two different types of adequacy. Dolgoff, in your Dolgoff reading, Dolgoff comments about both horizontal adequacy and vertical adequacy. And so what that distinction means is we're talking about the coverage or the reach of your program versus the depth of your program or policy. And so in the former case, we're talking about horizontal adequacy. So does your policy or program reach its intended audience, in which case you're commenting on the horizontal adequacy of your chosen policy or program. And commenting on the depth of programming offered by your agency is what we refer to as vertical adequacy. So let me give you a quick example here. If we're talking about the Alzheimer's Association, for example, and they're seeking to reach almost all the families, or maybe all the families that are affected by Alzheimer's in the state of Illinois, are they reaching their intended audience? Are they reaching all the families that may be affected by the disease? Right? That's commenting on the horizontal adequacy. That's something you'll want to discuss in your papers. And then in the way of vertical adequacy, think about the different services or benefits that are offered by the agency. Once again, if you're talking about the Alzheimer's Association, and if they're offering something along the lines of just information about Alzheimer's disease, but not offering any sort of educational component or support groups or counseling for that matter, that's more in the way of the depth of the programming that's offered. That's an issue of vertical adequacy. So you want to comment on both the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension of the services that are offered by your agency in the last section of your paper. All right, so that concludes this lecture, and also this is concluding the first half material. And so next up is getting ready for your midterm. And so we've concluded week 6, and then we'll pick up with lectures in week 9 with discussion of Social Security and TANF. That's when we actually dive into discussion of specific policies and programs.